To the
Okay, then I.
Okay,
Okay,
cool.
so now I've
Yeah.
got a message.
Yeah, if you want
Yep.
to ask the question again. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, we'll just get to ask the questions. Yeah. Oh yeah, okay. All right. I'll ask the question again. All right, so I was wondering if yeah, sorry. So I was wondering what you think about Spinoza's substance monism, right? Like his argument for God.
Okay, so it's kind of complicated whether it's an argument for God or not, because indifferently he talks about God and nature. And so some people have interpreted Spinoza as a kind of pantheist, and some people have just interpreted him as an atheist, and some people have interpreted him as being some kind of theist. Um, he does give this argument that's fairly early on in the ethics, but it's not clear that you can really interpret it as the kind of argument that theists give that they call ontological arguments, partly because it's not clear that it's an argument for the existence of God. So I wondered if there's anything else to your question, anything else that you wanted to ask me about. I mean, in particular, if you're a fan of the argument, you might want to say some more.
Yeah, so I guess I'd like to follow up by asking if you like it seems to me that you don't think that his a category a definition of what God is appropriate. Um yeah, like I was wondering if
So I guess that's right, because it's suppose that I run some kind of argument for the claim that it's necessary that the universe exists. And by the universe, I just mean the kind of physical universe. It will be very odd for someone to turn around and say, well, that was a proof of the existence of God. So it really matters what exactly it is that Spinoza, what exactly is the conclusion of the argument that Spinoza's giving. And if I gave you an argument that there's just one substance, and it turned out that that substance was somehow or other the universe, that also wouldn't be an argument for the existence of God, not by my lights anyway.
yeah. Do you have any other questions there? Yeah. Yeah, like I'd be happy to go into some other questions. Sorry, I'll pass it on to other people, but I guess my understanding is that Spinoza wanted to figure out what was the most reasonable way to think about what God was, and his conception of God being this one substance from which all of reality is derived. It seemed to him, and I would also agree that it seems like the most coherent like way to think of God if you're thinking about this perfect being. So yeah, like that's what I'd say. Like I don't
Yeah.
know if you have.
Okay. So that makes his conception of God quite different from, say, the Thomistic conception of God, where God doesn't turn out to be a substance, I don't think, in the sense that Spinoza's thinking. And so maybe that helps to explain why opinion divides so much on whether Spinoza's offering any kind of theism.
Thanks a lot, Graham. Thank you. All right, Lorenzo.
Hi, Graham. First of
Hi.
all, it's a huge honor to see you. So good stuff. I'm a bit shy. Anyway, so I guess I'll start asking my question. So because I know that you are a very prominent philosopher of religion, I'm sure you're more than aware of St. Thomas's five ways for the existence of God. And I guess I asked this in a kind of like, I guess, instructional way. I know the structure of the five ways, and I know that like one distinction that they use to kind of defend that scholastics and other theists would use to defend the five ways from attack from, criticisms against something like the Kalam cosmological argument would be to deploy the distinction between a substantially ordered series versus an accidentally ordered series. So, like, I'm sure that you're aware of this distinction. So I guess my question would be, first of all, like how would you characterize that distinction between substantially ordered series and accidentally ordered series? And if you think that this is part of why the five ways don't work, what about those what about that distinction in particular do you find fault with? Is it something to do with the metaphysics behind the distinction? Is it something about the structure of that distinction? Is it something else? And I guess something moving on to that is there anything in the way that the five ways are presented that structurally kind of, I guess, in an argument in logical form doesn't work? So anyway, thank you for that.
Okay, good. So the distinction that you're adverting to has to do with where the causal oomph comes from. Whether you have, say, I punch a ball and the ball moves, then you can think of that as abstracting from any wider considerations. It's just me punching. But on the other hand, if I've got holding a stick and I'm using the stick to roll a ball, then the oomph is coming from my arm, even though the stick is sort of in contact with the ball. It's not really providing the force to the ball, right? So that's the distinction intuitively in terms of an example. Now, given the examples, it's clear that we have instances of both. We have sort of per se ordered causal series, and we have per accidens ordered causal series. The thing that's kind of interesting when you go to the relevant one of the five ways, or maybe it's both the first way and the second way, is that the ways start by observing examples in nature, in the natural world of causation, and arguing that those things can't go back and back and back, that they've got to terminate somewhere. But if you take the kind of plausible examples like the one with the ball and the stick, it terminates with me. It doesn't terminate with God. Or if you take another example that's sometimes given, I'll give you a couple more of these kinds of examples. If you've got a bunch of railway carriages moving along on a line, there's an engine, and the causal oomph ends with the engine. It's the thing that's making all of the carriages move, even though each one is being immediately moved by the next. Or to take a third example, if you've got a pile of bricks, and each brick is being held up by the one below it, you get down to the earth, and the earth is holding up the bricks, and there isn't anything that's holding up the earth. So these series all terminate, but they don't terminate in God, right? And so that makes the argument look really problematic to me. You've got to have some special causal series, right, that you're referring to in order to get it go back to God. So Ed Feser, when he gives this kind of argument, appeals to something that it seems to me you just can't see in the world, right? But the way started with observation. It started with a relationship that's there in the world. And that, I think, is what's problematic, really, about the argument.
If I may extend and provide like some sort of response against that, I know that the way that it's been characterized, at least these types of metaphysical categories that demand essentially ordered causal series, would actually be something. It would be something like, oh, the biological world kind of supervenes on the chemical world, supervenes on the physical world, such that those things kind of depend on each other in a way that seems to indicate a kind of essential order, right? And that usually, at least to me, is the way that it's been presented regarding the five ways that I think seems more that I think escapes from the kind of naive, obvious examples, which you're right, does kind of seem to terminate on a single thing kind of sufficiently. So what would your response be to that, if that made any sense?
So, I mean, I guess one question is whether that really fits the text. Do we really observe, just by looking around us, that everything supervenes on the physical in that way? I mean, I'm actually really tempted by the view that you don't have a kind of determination of everything chemical by everything physical, right? And I agree that there's a kind of supervenience. You can't have a change at the way things are so at the level of chemistry without a change of physics, right? You can't get molecules moving around unless the electrons are moving around. And similarly, at the biological level, you can't get plants and animals, well, let's make it animals moving around unless there's chemical changes and physical changes going on. So, but I don't think that that's a matter of that's not something that we see. It's not evident to the senses. But Aquinas is very explicit. It's evident to the senses, right? The thing that the relationship that he's talking about is evident to the senses. Now, the other thing I was going to say, although I'm happy with supervenience, I'm not happy with determination. I don't think that what happens at the level of biology is determined by what happens at the level of physics. Right? I'm not a reductionist in that sense.
Okay. Well, that's all I have for now. Thank you, Graham.
Is that it?
Yeah, that's
right. Was it Paris next? Yeah. Ready to go? Anyone else have questions after Paris? Next to you. You be ready, Jones?
Hello, Graham. Nice to meet you. It's an honor. I had many questions, so I might just ask one for now and then go back to my seat.
You can ask several because
I can ask several.
Yeah.
Okay. So my first one is on the Kalam cosmological argument. I was looking through your book at the objections, and I didn't see this one in there, so I was thinking maybe you disagree with it or something. So I was thinking of what do you think about using like B theory in philosophy of time or eternalism, and then trying to object to the premise that things that begin to exist that the universe began to exist, because it seems that if you try to argue for B theory, let's say this relativity or something like that, and then it seems that one of the consequences is that you get like a 4D block theory of time, and then it seems like one of the consequences for persistence is things don't really begin to exist. And I think found a video of William Lane Craig saying something that along the lines of, under B theory, the universe doesn't really begin to exist any more than a stick begins to exist at the first inch. That is just to say that it has an edge. So what were your thoughts on that in philosophy of time?
Okay, so Craig definitely thinks that his argument presupposes A theory rather than B theory, or three-dimensional rather than dimensionalism rather than four-dimensionalism, or whatever, that it matters how you think about the metaphysics of time. I'm inclined to think that he's wrong about that. I don't see why you can't say that the edge of the block universe is its beginning, right? And you might think that if it's got an edge, you want some explanation of why it's the way it is at the edge, right? You can explain all the later things maybe in terms of the laws and the conditions at the edge, but you don't, there's something different about the edge that you might think makes it appropriate to talk about it as a beginning.
Okay, so you think it's not a very good objection?
Well, I actually think that Craig thinks that it's a good objection, right? So he thinks if you could convince him that general relativity requires taking on a four-dimensionalist stance, then he would abandon the Kalam argument. But I don't think he should. Right? I don't think that the argument stands or falls with the metaphysics of time. I don't think that it's that somehow or other, if he was persuaded, that to take on four-dimensionalism, that he couldn't reconstruct the argument.
Okay.
Would I be able to interrupt that?
Yeah.
How would you explain how you would adjust the Kalam cosmological argument such that you don't think it requires the metaphysics of time, which you think Craig thinks is necessary?
So it depends what we mean by begins to exist, right? You might think that a thing has a beginning of existence just in case either there are earlier times in which it doesn't exist, or it exists at the first moment of time. Right? That's all that it's required. Four-dimensionalism doesn't say there's no times. It just says that all of the times are real. Right? So you end up with an account of what it is to begin to exist. And you might think that everything that begins to exist requires a cause. There's got to be something earlier. If it's a thing that exists in time, there's just got to be an earlier thing that brings it in, that, as we would say, brings it into existence at the time. There's a cause of its existence at the later time. Or in the case of the initial things, if you're Craig, God is the earlier, causally earlier, not temporally earlier cause of the existence of the things that exist at the first moment of time. That's what I think Craig should say. I mean, he has a different account of begins to exist that's crafted so that it fits three-dimensionalism, but I don't see why you can't recraft a definition that will fit for four-dimensionalism.
Yeah. If anyone else had any.
Yeah, you're good. Keep going.
Okay. So another question, I think more about epistemology this time. I hope you don't mind, because we said we were going to talk about atheism, but so I was looking at, it's a bit of a two-part question. I was looking at one of the YouTube videos that you had in a Discord debate, and then you said something like your general argument for atheism, like with the theories. You said it's neither deductive, inductive, or abductive. But maybe you can clarify this, but it looks like an abductive argument to me. It looks like you're saying, we're invoking the idea of explanations towards a set of propositions, saying, we have these two possible explanations, theism and atheism, and then atheism is the better one because it's simpler and explains just as much. And then the second part of the question is, maybe if you want to answer that first, but the second part, I was just wanted to poke and say, I think you might be a coherentist for philosophy of truth, or perhaps like also an internalist. Well, maybe I was just going to poke around and say, why do you believe that? And maybe that second part, maybe the first part of the question turns on the second part. But I know that was a bit much, but what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, so let's take the first thing and then come back to the second thing. So, so the question that I was asked was, the first part of it was, I think, whether my favourite argument is an abductive argument or whether it's an inference to the best explanation. I just think they're the two ways of describing the same thing. I think that the way that Peirce thought about abduction was very similar to the way that Harman thought about inference to the best explanation. So, but maybe I misunderstood the question. It was a long time since you asked it, so maybe.
Yeah, I was just asking, because it looks like an abductive argument in the sense that it's like talking about, that you have these two explanations, and then, atheism is like a better explanation than theism. So I was wondering if you thought that it was like an abductive argument, only because I remember a YouTube video that you had in a Discord call, and you said something like that it's neither inductive, deductive, or abductive.
So if I said that, that doesn't sound right. I mean, okay. I think that it's what we're doing is theory choice, and we're trying to pick the best theory, and we're thinking that what makes for a good theory is how it manages the trade-off between minimizing commitments and maximizing explanation. And I assume that that's so that it's kind of Occam's razor, but I assume that that's how Peirce thought about inference to the best explanation. It's certainly how I thought about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the second part of the question was just so I think I found a survey where you said that you're an internalist about justification and also like a coherentist about truth. And I was wondering, because it seems like, that really seems to come out when you start talking about the theory choice and stuff in your arguments for atheism. But I thought, I wanted to push you and say, why do you think those as opposed to, say, like externalism for justification and the correspondence theory of truth for truth?
So I'm surprised that I tick coherence theory of truth. I wouldn't have thought that I would done that. I tend to favour sort of Quine's close cousin of the redundancy theory of truth. So basically, to say that P is true is just equivalent to saying that P, but the truth predicate is valuable because of sentences like everything the Pope says is true, which you can only express by some form, otherwise expressed by some form of quantification over an infinite number of sentences or something like that. So that's my preferred view about truth. On the external justification, so I'm not sure exactly really what I want to say about that. I'm even less confident about that than I am about truth. But there's got to be something that's importantly internal about what makes for rational belief, I think. And so that, I guess that means I lean towards some kind of internals.
Okay. I had a third question as well, which was mainly about miracles. So, because I think in your book you say something like you reject Hume's arguments against the rationality of miracles, and I was thinking like, because it seems like we might want to reject miracles in virtue of them being improbable. For example, if you hopped on the bus one day and the guy next to you said that he saw a unicorn, I think that we would rationally try to reject that because we think, it seems like a bit of an outrageous claim. And it's not, even if you say like, oh, he's a really honest guy and this and that, it still seems that the claim that unicorns exist is something that we should reject in virtue of it being very improbable. What were your thoughts on that?
Okay, so Hume has two arguments in the inquiry against miracles. One of them's a kind of a priori argument that's based on his definition of a miracle, and that which is contrary to the laws of nature. And that argument, I think, doesn't work. But the other argument that he's got in the inquiries against miracles is really good, right? And that argument is pretty close to what you just said, right? You have testimony to miracles, and the question that you ask yourself is, so what's more likely, that this event actually happened, that the claim that's being put forward is true, or that something's gone wrong, either with the testifier or it's a chain of testimony somewhere else earlier in the chain of testimony. And Hume thinks that it's kind of like a brick, that when someone gives you a miracle claim, the much more plausible thing to think is either that there's something wrong with them or there's something wrong with the testimonial chain that goes further back. So your person who says that they saw a unicorn, I think I kind of favour that there's something wrong with them if they're making that claim.
Yeah, and a bit of a follow-up question to that. Do you also think that we should reject miracles because they're unfalsifiable? Of course, theists like to say something like, unfalsifiability doesn't matter because, they're still possible. But I don't think it's about whether they're possible or not. The atheists can accept that they're possible. It's more to do with it being a bad explanation compared to others. I recall one professor I was having a chat with, he summarized it by saying, and I agree with this, that what unfalsifiability does is take views into a land insulated from epistemic contact at the cost of making them oddly without points. So what are your thoughts on that, unfalsifiability?
So I'm inclined to think that taking it that miracles are interventions into the course of nature by God. Given that I think that there's no God, of course I think that there are no miracles, right? And so, depending how confident I am that there's no God, I'm confident before I hear any claim that if it's a miracle claim, it's not going to be true. Right? There's a kind of massive improbability that attaches to the claims just because I think that it's massively improbable that there's a God. I don't know that the kind of unfalsifiability is a kind of interesting consideration. I'm much more interested in kind of straight out, it's impossible.
Okay. I think that was all the questions from me. So I'll go back to my seat. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hello, Dr. Oppy.
Hi.
Massive pleasure to talk with you. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. I wanted to ask you very broadly, this may be a demanding question, so feel free to, I guess, answer as much or as little of it as you'd like. I wanted to know very broadly, I guess, what your philosophy of mind is, given I assume you're a materialist, like how you'd address qualia, consciousness, intentionality, and then I guess something like personhood or the self. Why you believe it has more explanatory power or is better than something like hylomorphism, and then following on from that, what issues you see with hylomorphism as a philosophy of mind. If that's too much, break it down.
It's quite a lot.
Yeah.
So my preferred position is a sort of cousin of the position that Smart had in identity and brain processing. So my preferred position is that, to use this terminology, mental events are just brain events. Perhaps unlike Smart, I'm prepared to think, though I kind of wonder whether I should, that for someone who has certain kinds of brain events going on in them, there's something that it's like for that person. There's something that it's like to be that person. So Smart talks about, having something going on in you, like what's going on in you when you look at a ripe tomato, as a kind of explanation of what it is to see red. But he doesn't take the extra step of talking about there being something that it's like for the person who has that event going on in them when they look at the ripe tomato. But I think that you can say that. And once you've said that, I don't see that there's anything left to say about qualia or really about consciousness either. Consciousness is just a matter of certain events going on in your brain. Okay, so that's the kind of the philosophy of mind. That doesn't get you to what I want to say about persons, and it doesn't answer all the questions about philosophy of mind. So to take one example, what I just said leaves it completely open whether animals have mental states. It leaves it open whether aliens could have mental states. It leaves it open whether AIs could have mental states. All I've told you about is what it is for human organisms to have mental states. For them, it's a matter of certain processes going on in their brains. Exactly what you say beyond that depends, right? You might have a kind of restricted type identity view where you just say it's something quite different that's going on in aliens when they, for example, have red experiences. It's something quite different. But there's a type for humans and there's a type for aliens as well. Okay, so that's kind of qualia and consciousness.
Sure.
Persons, I don't know. The literature on personal identity is really tricky. There's lots of hard cases to think about. Oh, I should have said one other thing about the qualia and consciousness. I don't think that zombies are possible. It couldn't be that this stuff is going on in your brain and there's nothing that it's like for you to have those processes going on in you. So that's the way that I respond to Chalmers. Okay, on the personal identity, I guess I kind of favour the view, and you'd expect me to say this, given what I've just said about favouring identity theory for questions about mental states and brain states, that the identity conditions for human organisms are kind of straightforward. They're just physical continuity conditions. Whether you want to say that human organisms can be kind of alive and functioning and not persons is the kind of central question to ask next. And I don't believe in things like that you could upload from one person into another person, download a brain and upload it into another brain. I don't think that that's ever going to be possible. So certain kinds of thought experiments about personal identity aren't interesting to me. But I think I'm quite happy to say that Phineas Gage was the same person before and after his accident. I'm so sure that's a kind of metaphysical question. From a personal point of view, if you think about not the kind of metaphysical self, but the psychological self, you might think that there were very dramatic changes that happened to Phineas Gage's personality in a way that deeply impacted the way that he and other people thought about him, right? And maybe you can think of, in some sense, there's a kind of psychological self here that's different, but metaphysically, he's the same person, according to me. That's still not quite everything. There's the question about holomorphism, which I don't. I guess there's background metaphysics here, which I'm just not inclined to accept. So the disagreement's going to be about that. It's not. So is that enough as a pass?
Yeah. Could I first of all, that's a lot. So thank you for getting through that all. Could I ask you about the background metaphysics? I guess in Aristotle's metaphysics, the main concepts I see are form, matter, substance, act, and potency. I'd say, which of those do you see a problem with or not buy into yourself?
So I'm not inclined to accept that we are. What's the right word? That we're that we have form and matter as parts that are joined together somehow. That level of analysis doesn't seem right to me. I think that we have spatial parts. I don't think that we have, if this is the right terminology, logical parts. Right. So I don't think that we are that there's a joining together of form in us.
Okay. If I could ask one more, act and potency as well. Would you say those are real concepts, or more nominalistic?
So I go backwards and forwards a little bit on this. I'm inclined to think most of the time that I should believe in causal powers, but so I'm inclined to think that there's a power that electrons have to repel other electrons and to attract protons. Exactly how that's related, how the disposition and the power are related, I haven't thought about that kind of topic enough to have a kind of informed opinion about it. I do think that I'm inclined to think of modality as a more primitive part of my worldview than lots of people who believe in powers are inclined to make it. So I think of if you want to think about what's possible for the world, the universe as a whole, and you're thinking about the evolution of state of the universe, I'm assuming that the evolution of state is indeterministic, and the possibilities are just all the different ways that the indeterminism can play out. Right. So that, because I suspect that quantum mechanics gives you lots of indeterminism, there are lots of things about me that are sort of indeterministic in the long term, even if in the very short term, I'm not really affected by the quantum indeterminacy, and so what I'm going to do, kind of a fraction of a second ahead of any time that I designate as now, might be quite determinate. What I'm going to do tomorrow won't be, because of the way in which the quantum indeterminacy kind of bubbles up
Okay. Yeah.
from the micro realm to the macro realm.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Okay, cheers.
Hello, Mr. Oppy. It's nice to meet you.
Hi.
I just have a brief question about some of your addresses to fine-tuning. Namely, what is divine psychology, and why do you feel like that's a failure in the fine-tuning argument?
Okay, so now I'm trying to remember where this goes. So what I think is this. The way that the fine-tuning argument goes in its kind of interesting form, at the initial state of the universe, there are all these things that are just fixed, right? The things that are supposed to be fine-tuned, they're all fixed at that point. It's not supposed to be that they're not fixed and then they kind of transition to being fixed by some indeterministic process. Because if that's the story, then we have the explanation and the improbability is irrelevant, right? The fact that it could have played out in lots of different ways doesn't matter if we know that it was the result of some indeterministic process. So we're supposing they're fixed at the beginning. And what we want to do is explain why the values are as they are at the beginning. And one thing that you can do, as Hume pointed out in the dialogues in a kind of related context, is just say it's a kind of intrinsic to the initial state that the values are as they are. Now, there's a different thing that you can do. You can postulate God, and you can say something like, God wanted the values to be as they are. Now, the question is about, okay, so God wants them to be as they are. Is that intrinsic to God or not? If it's intrinsic to God, then in every world, right, the values are going to be the same. They're going to turn out to be necessary. So maybe it's not intrinsic to God. But if it's not intrinsic to God, what's the range of possibilities here? Because presumably there's no explaining why God wants them to be one way rather than another amongst all of the possible ways that the universe could be that God could make, right? Because we're now supposing that God just varies. God wants these values in this world, he wants these other values in another world, right? And there is a different option, which is that it's kind of indeterministic. God has a range of things and just wants, and one of them pops up. But now, if the range of possibilities is the same according to the people who just allow that it's a kind of brute fact what the values are in the initial state of the universe, you haven't got any explanatory advance by postulating God, because you've just pushed the thing that you're not explaining, the bruteness, back one step, right? So there's a question. I think this is a real question, whether the kinds of things that are supposed to be possible alternatives here, right, the range of values, are real possibilities or not. And you can take that view whether you're a naturalist or a theist, right? If you're a naturalist, you've just got to say, epistemically, we thought that there were options, but there aren't. If you're a theist and you want to say that God's omnipotent, you face a different problem, because it looks as though if God's omnipotent, God could make any of these set of values, including lots and lots of ones outside the range. But then what's going on in the worlds where God does that? Because for these things to be possible, given that every world starts with God, it's got to be that God does it, right? So there's a serious question here about the divine psychology. That's the thought.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah. Any questions after?
Hey Graham, pleasure to meet you.
Hi there.
I had a few questions. So, I'll start with this one. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of part of your position on the modal ontological argument is that it's not clear that a maximally great being is even possible. And I was wondering what you think generally make good reasons to believe something is possible in the first place, and then why is it that you think that sort of reasoning doesn't apply to a being that's maximally great?
Okay, so if you think about the modal ontological argument in kind of very simple terms, it's got a premise that says necessarily if God exists, then it's necessary that God exists. And I'm going to suppose for now that we just hold that fixed. Right, so there are now kind of two ways that people can go consistently. Either they can think that God exists, it's necessary that God exists, and it's possible that God exists, or they can think that God doesn't exist, it's possible that God doesn't exist, and it's necessary that God doesn't exist. And in each case, it looks like there's one claim that seems quite strong and one that seems quite weak, and then there's the God exists or God doesn't, which is just what we disagree about, right? So the claim that it's possible that God doesn't exist seems like quite a weak claim. We just need one possible world where there's no God. That doesn't seem very strong. On the other hand, necessarily there's no God sounds very strong. All the possible worlds have to contain no God. On the other hand, if you go the other side, possibly God exists, that sounds pretty weak, right? We only need one world in which God exists, but necessarily God exists, that sounds really strong, right? God has to exist in all worlds. So it looks as though there's nothing here really that favors one view over the other. You've got to make a choice. You've got to pick one of because we're insisting that necessarily if God exists, it's necessary that God exists. You've either got to pick it's necessary that God exists, or you've got to pick it's necessary that God doesn't exist, right? And the fact that we can now run an argument for either of those conclusions from this premise, just using the relevant possibility premise, kind of undercuts the idea that there's a good argument here, right? We've got a kind of equally good argument for either alternative.
Sure.
Right now, so that's the once you're insisting that we're on the kind of necessarily God exists or necessarily God doesn't exist, right? It looks as though either way you're making a claim that you know that other people are just going to reject.
Okay, fair enough. That does help. Thank you. So I also wanted to know that it seems to me recently there's been some movement among theists away from forms of divine simplicity and towards theistic personalism. And I wonder if you find that one position is more problematic than the other.
Okay, sorry, I'm just making a note to remind myself. So one question is just about is there a movement? That's really hard to assess. There are there are plenty of people, traditional Catholics, believe in divine simplicity, and there are plenty of people who maybe won't call it traditional Protestantism, but for a long time there have been Protestants who reject divine simplicity. So an example of the latter kind, Planting has a book called Does God Have a Nature? And that's just an extended argument against divine simplicity. There are lots of people who work in philosophy of religion, including a bunch of Protestants and a bunch of people who are agnostics or atheists, who kind of ridicule divine simplicity. But there are still plenty of Catholic philosophers that accept it. And although, even though I don't think there's a God, I don't think that God's simple, I'm not inclined to ridicule the idea of divine simplicity. In fact, in the late 90s, I wrote a paper where I defended the coherence of the idea in the following way. I thought that you could say that there's a bunch of claims that are just true. God's omnipotent, God's omniscient, God's perfectly good, and so on. And they have a single truth maker, God, right? So they're all made true by the same thing. And that's a way of defending divine simplicity, because all of the claims have the same truth maker. And in the early 2000s, Jeff Brower and some other people developed a similar sort of thesis. So if you look up Brower, you can find a bunch of papers where he defends this kind of idea. Right. So I'm inclined to think that it's not incoherent. I do agree that it's kind of a hard saying, right, to say that God's omnipotence is God's omniscience is God's perfect goodness and so on, and they're all God. But the truth maker claim just kind of gives you, well, okay, so God makes them all true. And it's not because there are distinctions in God, by the way, but it's God, just God, that makes all the claims true.
Yeah.
It's not God's being good that makes it true that God's good. It's just God makes it true.
Okay, thank you. Another question I had written down was, what do you think of arguments from personal experience that involve the communication of predictions about the future? So especially where predictions are validated instead of falsified. It seems that in such cases, a belief in God in those times may have predictive power.
Right. So when we conduct experiments these days, we do pre-registration of our experiences, our experiments, and we record all the claims, and they're written down in a safe place, right? So that people know what we were predicting. We don't have any guarantee for texts that were written a long time ago, whether there was any form of pre-registration or whether the predictions were written down long after events happened. So that would be the kind of most obvious thing to say. Right.
What about contemporary? Sorry, what about contemporary examples?
So the same thing would be true. We want to see the pre-registration, but we want to see the pre-registration of all the predictions that were made, because it's very easy for me to pick all the winners in the next round of football if you let me write down whatever the factorial is, 9 factorial, whatever it is, results, right? So then I just throw all the envelopes away except the winning one, and then I say, look, I predicted it. Well, that doesn't count, right? And nor does the kind of reinterpreting things that are really obscure, right, in the light of the events that subsequently happened in order to claim that they were predicted. That doesn't really have any evidential value either. Right. So sure, if you can predict the future in detail in ways that where you just pre-register a bunch of claims and then they all come out true, well, sure, there's something interesting going on there. Maybe though you've been visited by a time traveler from the future. I mean, there are other hypotheses that we can then bring into play.
Yeah. So even if it wasn't like looking at evidence of this from somebody else, let's say, for example, you experience a voice and it says, Graham, this will happen 30 seconds from now. And it's like totally something unpredictable to you. And it does occur 30 seconds later. Do you think that would have like a significant impact upon like your beliefs or?
So it's interesting. I mean, this is kind of like Hume's voice from the sky that speaks to everybody in their own language simultaneously and says, I'm God, and boy, you better start doing what I said in my book, or it's, whatever. So what I'm inclined to say about Hume's example is that we've got no reason to think that something like that could happen. And so now I'm going to say the same thing to you, except, of course, it could happen because I'm being tricked. It could happen because I'm losing my mind. There are various hypotheses that could explain it. right? If something small like that were to happen, right? I guess I'm not worried about it, but I'm getting old.
Fair enough. Okay. So what do you think of or make of theists that ground their belief in an obvious or apparent seeming of things? So do you think such people are safe to make an analogy between God and other minds?
So say the first part again.
What do you make of theists that ground their belief in God in an obvious or apparent seeming of things?
Seeming of
Seeming of things. It seems to be the case
Yep.
that there's a God, in the same way that there seems to be a case that solipsism is false.
So I guess, I mean, the idea that there's an analogy between the existence of God and the existence of other minds goes back at least to Planting as God and Other Minds, that was written in the 60s. I'm not inclined to think that I infer to the existence of other minds. I think it's kind of obvious that cats and dogs have minds, for example. Never mind other people. So I don't think that it's a mere seeming. That's the ground of my belief in other minds. On the other hand, I'm prepared to allow that there's lots of evidence for other minds, and that you could, if you were trying to I don't know who you'd be trying to persuade, but if you were trying, I mean, it's not really coherent now, right? But if you started worrying about whether there were other minds, I think you should be able to just go and talk to people and watch the birds, the animals, and so on, and think, no, that's crazy, right? The world's not set up in such a way that there's a similarity here with the case of belief in the existence of God, which though there are people who claim that it's kind of obvious, you look at the starry heavens and you can see that they were made by God and so on. There's nothing kind of globally universal about that in the way that everybody, except the deluded, recognizes that mindedness is spread widely through the animal kingdom, including with us. Whereas it seems, right, that God did those things is obviously highly local and highly, I'll say it like this, contaminated by prior theory or something like that. So that's what I'm inclined to say. I mean, I don't know if that's enough, but
No, that's interesting. Actually, I was thinking a little bit about something you said, partly to the previous questioner and then partly in response to the modal ontological argument I gave before. And I was wondering if you think, and this is sort of in the moment, but if somebody holds to the existence of necessary moral truths and the idea that there's something morally good about fulfilling duties, that if it's possible, a perfectly moral being exists, and that moral duties are necessary and therefore exist in all possible worlds, that this possible perfectly moral being might also have to exist in every possible world in order to fulfill those moral duties that exist in every possible world.
okay. So whenever the conversation switches to morality, I like to think about analogies with mathematics. So I think that it's necessarily true that 2 and 2 are 4. I don't think there's any possible worlds in which 2 and 2 adds up to something else. But I'm not inclined to think that Platonism is true. So I don't think there are numbers. So I don't think that there's kind of these necessarily existing truth makers for the claim. So what I'm inclined to think is that here we have an example of a claim that's objectively true, right? But not made true by anything.
Oh, okay.
right? So we have a kind of primitive necessity here. Right now, what I'm inclined to do then is to say the same can be true about morality, right? If you think that moral truths are necessary, I think that the best view is not to have one where you have a truth maker for the moral claims. It's rather that you just take it that I think this suggestion isn't unfriendly to theism, right? You want to think that God's necessarily good. What's the truth maker for that going to be? Well, I suppose you can think, well, it's just God, right? But if you don't accept that, then it feels to me like the best thing to do is to accept that this is just a primitive fact.
Thank you. Sort of left a fun one for last. I wanted to know what argument for theism you believe is the most convincing or has the potential to be so, and whether or not it's given you any moment for pause.
So, okay, so when I wrote arguing about gods, the thesis was there are no good arguments on any side. There are no good arguments for atheism or agnosticism, right? And I'm still inclined to think that. When I wrote the best argument against God, I made it very clear that I didn't think it was a good argument. I just thought it was the best of a bad lot. So I'm kind of not... I never really thought, oh, there are convincing arguments in here somewhere if we just keep looking. And I leave it open as a theoretical possibility that someone someday might come up with a convincing argument. Obviously, we don't know everything yet, and we never will. But I'd be prepared to bet quite a lot that we aren't ever going to come up with a good argument in this area. Okay, so that's kind of one side of it. On the other hand, amongst the arguments that we've got, there are some that we haven't said the last word on. Right? So Anselm's ontological argument is a good example. I don't think that we have a kind of complete account of that argument. And I think that something similar is true for the fine-tuning arguments. I don't think that we're anywhere near kind of expert agreement on fine-tuning arguments. We're nowhere close to having a comprehensive understanding of them either. And that's partly because we're nowhere close to having a comprehensive understanding of whether there is fine-tuning, and if so, what exactly it is, and so on.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.
We next have Professor James Franklin from UNSW. I'd like to ask a few questions.
Yeah, hi. I think we're the Guy. I think we're the only people here over 25, let alone over 60. Whether it's doing us any good, I'm not sure. People have asked a lot about various particular arguments. I wonder, could you give your view of the kind of overview of the field, like from both the atheist and the theist perspective? So, for example, from the atheist perspective, what are the important things? Is it presumption of atheism? Is it refuting particular arguments like fine-tuning or whatever? Or is it anti-religious arguments like the problem of evil? And on the other hand, from the theist perspective, where do you think the theist ought to be going? What should they be emphasising?
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, there are features of the field that are quite, well, I'll say interesting. Maybe that's not the right word. So I take the field to be philosophy of religion. An awful lot of philosophy of religion is about Christianity. There's not very much comparatively, especially in North America, but even elsewhere, about even Islam and Judaism. Though there has been some movement on this in the last decade or so. But you get quite different conceptions of God in Christianity and in Islam. There's lots of discussion in contemporary Christian circles about theories of the Trinity, trying to work out what to say about that. Whereas in Islam, there's a very different attitude towards the doctrine of the Trinity, right? So, talking about what the problems are, or what are the big issues, is going to depend on really which people you pick out, which group of people you pick out that you're asking this question of. For me, the kind of interesting questions from an atheist point of view are about the development of worldviews that entail atheism. So I think, although other people, like, for example, Philip Goff, disagree, I think that the kind of naturalism that I endorse just entails atheism. The interesting questions are about developing the naturalistic worldview. On the theistic side, I think that something similar is true or should be true. So I wrote a book with Kenny Pierce, a debate about the existence of God, and in that book, I've kind of presented a large amount of what I thought a kind of sensible naturalistic worldview should look like. And what Kenny did was produce some arguments that in favour, that were meant to be kind of persuasive arguments for the existence of God, whereas I would have liked to have seen a lot more of the trying to develop his Christian worldview in places where he acknowledged that his understanding kind of fell short. Because I think that kind of working out the views in as much detail as we can is the first step before we start comparing them. And I think that there's nowhere near enough trying to develop views on both sides, and too much trying to come up with arguments that have as conclusions either that God exists or that God doesn't exist. Okay, so there's a start.
Well, yeah, but that's all good. I don't quite understand from that. If I ask you, why do you really believe in atheism? I mean, what's salient for you, and what is kind of just debating points?
So, well, okay, so I'm not sure how to answer that question, right? Why do I really believe? I believe a whole lot of things, and those things, when you put them together, entail that there are no gods of any sort. How did I acquire these beliefs? I've been thinking about and arguing with people since I was at school, since I was in the early years of secondary school, when I ceased to believe in God. So it's not that I think that there are particular claims that are kind of more important than others. There's a global theory that I've got, or a worldview, or whatever you want to call it. And it's just part of that worldview that there's no God, or that there are no gods, I should say.
Okay, no, that's all for the moment. Yeah.
Would you be willing to spell out the main features of that worldview you think are most salient for the audience?
Okay, so in the debate book with Kenny Pierce, there are, in the setting out section, I think there are 48 sections, each one which picks up a particular point that's kind of salient. So it's a bit hard, other than kind of getting the book off the shelf and running through the whole list, to give you all of the points. One thing, and another thing that makes this difficult is that on lots of the points, I'm kind of undecided between 2 or 3 options as well. So I have a kind of favoured position, but then I have other things that I might say. So, so let me illustrate this. When you think about why is there something rather than nothing, right, there's a bunch of answers that you might give to that question. You might say, and by the something I mean things in the universe. Why are there cats, or electrons? But generically, why are there things in the universe? So one answer that you might give is that there had to be, right? It's necessary that the universe exists, the things of the universe exist. One answer that you might give is there's no reason, right? It's just brute contingency that there's something rather than nothing. Another answer that you might give, though, I don't know, maybe your temperament's different from mine, but you might find this one harder to accept, is because it's good. There are things, because it's good that those things exist. Another thing that you might say is there are things because there's always been things. There's just this infinite regress of things. And another thing you might say is there are things because there are things in the universe because God made the universe, right? So there's 5 hypotheses about why there are electrons and cats and dogs and planets and stars and so on. Now, I kind of lean towards the view that the best thing to say at this point, if you're a naturalist, is that the initial part of the universe is necessary, the laws are necessary, and the evolution of the state of the universe is deterministic, and that accounts for why there are things and why there's the range of things that there are. So if you want a kind of short answer, it's that there had to be. Right? I think that's, but I'm not super confident that that's right. Right? I'm not super confident that there's an initial state. Maybe there, although it looks like the universe began sort of where this side of a big explosion, right, in our part of causal reality, it might be that there's an infinite regress. There are cosmological models developed by people like Anthony Aguirre, which have an infinite past. And so while I kind of lean towards, okay, there's an origin, I'm not super confident that that's true. Right. And
another question. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just leave it there, right? So it's not easy. It's not easy to briefly answer the question. What I think.
I think we had another question from Stefan. Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Oppy.
Hi.
I have a question that sort of riffs off what was being said earlier. Sorry, my hair looks really weird. I'm just gonna, riffs off what was being said earlier about substantially ordered and accidentally ordered when it comes to causal series. I wanted to sort of clarify a bit more on what your position was concerning those. Like, is the distinction between them something that's like actually real, or is it something that's more conceptual, or is it, you know, even something that's more instrumental in sort of just how you as an individual sort of go about understanding, you know, like you talk about the oomph and that sort of thing. Just curious about that to start with.
So my answer to this is it depends what you take to be instances of substantially ordered causal series. If you take things like the stack of bricks or the carriages of a train as instances, then there's a genuine distinction here, right? Each carriage in the train is pulled along by the one in front of it, but the only real source of pulling is the engine, right? And so that gives you an example. So there really are substantially ordered causal series, right? However, those kinds of things can't be the kinds of things that Aquinas was appealing to in the 5 ways, because they terminate. We know what the source, what the original source of the motion change is, right? You might try to say that there's some other kind of series that's a substantially ordered causal series that you can put to work in the service of the 5 ways, right? And maybe you'll depart from Aquinas because you'll say that, unlike what Aquinas says, that whatever it is not evident to the senses, right? Which is important. I mean, that's in the wording of the first 2 ways. These things are evident to the senses. But then what will be controversial is whether there actually is a series of that kind. So maybe I can sum this up. I do think that there are substantially ordered series, but I am very skeptical that there's one that fits the requirements of the first way or the second way.
I mean, I guess there's two things I would sort of want to be a bit more sure about with that. One of them is that this is just a question of interpretation, I guess, so maybe not worth dwelling on too much. But I suppose when Aquinas does talk about manifest ways or evident to our senses in the first way, it seems to be with regards specifically to the fact that, quote, quote, it's in Latin, but some things are in motion, I suppose, rather than pointing to any particular causal chain per se and saying, well, that is, well, per se. And I guess the other thing I'd sort of want to clarify about then is, if you sort of label substantial and accidental in this way, do you think, for example, that you could have like a substantially ordered series and have it terminate specifically in something that is accidentally, sort of terminate in an infinite accidental causal chain? I suppose that's what I'd want to ask.
So what do you, sorry, I'm not quite getting it. What do you mean by terminate?
Yeah, so it's sort of like I'd have a substantially ordered, like a series that's ordered per se, and have it be that the sort of cause that it's sort of pointing at, or the engine, so to speak, in the train pulling analogy, is itself then the result of this infinitely long accidental chain.
Okay, sure. So suppose that the Earth was infinitely old, and just kind of each step in the history of the Earth, each movement from time to time is just accidental. Then you've got a stack of bricks sitting on the surface of the Earth, and each of the bricks is held up by the one below, but this terminates with the Earth. So there's the substantial chain that terminates with the Earth, even though you've got the Earth itself stands at the end of an accidental infinite series. Now, I'm not wedded to the infinite causal past. I actually prefer the idea that it's an initial state, right? But it seems to me that you can consistently put those ideas together.
With regards to the Earth and your bricks analogy, is it possible that the Earth itself is substantially caused by something else? And I know that specifically is not manifest in the sense.
Okay, but with respect to the holding up relation, nothing holds up the Earth. This substantial thing was with respect to that particular relation.
Yeah.
Right? There's a relation of holding up and it terminates. Right.
I guess you're right that with regards to holding up in that particular way, there would be that it would seem that the substantially ordered series would terminate quite simply at Earth. But I guess the fact that the Earth itself is liable to sort of being, and again, this does go a bit more into the territory of articulating a particular metaphysic, but let's just say that if the Earth is delimited in a certain way that's proper to its nature, so to speak, even though that's not even the right word to use, then it would seem that if that thing, that the Earth specifically, is substantially caused by something else, then the question, I suppose, does still sort of maintain itself in that regress, so to speak. I don't know if that's a fair thing to say or not.
Right.
How would you sort of think about it?
So caused in what way? The existence of the Earth or some fact about the Earth? I mean, you have to specify the nature. I mean, you have to specify the causal relation, right? The Earth has a history, right? So it's not like the Earth just popped into existence uncaused, right? There's a long history that starts way back with the first generation of stars going supernova. Then you get another generation of stars which in turn go supernova, but you get elements produced each time. By the third generation of the stars going supernova, you've got the various kinds of elements like iron and so on that make up the bulk of the Earth, right? So there's a history there, but that's all just accidental, right?
Yeah. So I suppose if I were to try and describe a substantial causal order that pertains to the Earth and not just something that accidentally pertains to the Earth. Do you think a viable way to go with that is the fact that it is, I guess, so to speak, in motion? And then if you sort of put that in dialogue with a Parmenidean versus Heraclitean, not sure how you say it. In that sense, would there be something fair to go from with that or no?
Okay, this is an interesting one. I assume that it can't be Aquinas because Aquinas didn't think that the Earth moves. I mean, he still had the Aristotelian view of the Earth stationary at the center of the universe.
I suppose the Earth doesn't move in locomotion, but does it still move in other senses? I don't
well,
know.
if you mean does it change? Yes. Right.
Okay.
So, and there's this dispute about whether we should read the way in terms of change or in terms of motion. So let's read it in terms of change. Okay. We've got temporal evolution. The Earth is changing. From the point where we say the Earth exists, there's change. The Earth's changing all the time. All of that looks accidental. There's motion, stuff in motion before the Earth comes to exist. There's more accidental stuff. If that goes back, but terminates in a necessary initial state of the universe with a kind of indeterministic evolution, right?
Yeah.
You don't get, nowhere in this is there a per se cause, per se causation. Nowhere. Right. So it's going to be contested. It's a controversial question, right? If that's the example that you're picking. That's not the kind of example that people typically choose.
Sure.
But I don't know of any example of a per se series that isn't completely controversial. It's only, you would only think that there was that series if you were a certain kind of theist who accepted basically Aquinas's metaphysics or something very similar to it.
Yeah. So if I were to sort of maybe try to understand your view, you would hold that these two kinds of causation are, very really distinct from each other. But because, you are maybe, maybe this is a fair way to talk about it, but you're going from things that you can see, which is quite fair enough. You're coming at it from maybe a naturalist perspective. There is nothing that you actually witness that seems to show per se causation that isn't already neatly terminating.
Yeah, that's right. That's the point, right? And of course, Thomas after Thomas have come up with what they think are examples of per se series that can only terminate in God. But those are, I'll put it this way, those are very controversial. It's controversial whether there are such series, and it's certainly not something, maybe you might think that it's evident to the intellect, but it's not generically evident to the intellect. There are lots of people who can't see it.
Sure. All right.
We might have Lorenzo next. Oh, actually, Chris.
Actually, would you like to go last?
Yeah, Chris will go.
Thank you very much, Doctor.
Yeah.
Hello, Mr. Oppy. Sorry, my question is a bit more personal, so I hope you don't mind. Would you say that you're happier as an atheist than you think you would be as a theist?
So I guess I think that if you think about the distribution of happiness over the people of the world, right? I mean, I don't quite know how you're going to measure it, though there is survey data about this, so maybe I'll come back to it. But I would think that you're going to have kind of normal distributions over atheists and theists. There'll be, or it'll be something. There'll be a statistical distribution, but it'll look something like a normal distribution. And there's a question, the only kind of interesting question is about where the means are, whether they coincide or whether kind of on average one group's happier than the other. so there are people who are, I mean, Hume would be a good example. He was a naturalist. He just seems to have been extraordinarily cheerful all the time, right? And then there are theists who are utterly despondent and miserable all the time, right? But you can't, from those kinds of data points, you can't infer anything. Now, of course, there's social science, but the social science is really hard to get a grip on. So there are studies that people have done about societal dysfunction and whether you're a theist or not a theist, say a theist and a naturalist, in countries like the United States. And it looks as though there's kind of no correlation, right, or anti-correlation between dysfunction, which you might think correlates with happiness, and whether
I had a bit of a follow-up question. Do you think that for our human civilization that we have more to benefit from largely gravitating towards atheism or gravitating towards theism?
I don't know. I think we do quite well if we don't gravitate either way. Because what I think there's always this risk that if one group becomes too dominant, it will start persecuting the other. And so I think that we stand to gain quite a lot by having sufficient numbers of each. That's not going to happen.
And I also just wanted to clarify one of the things that you were talking about with Steph. With the regression thing, are you saying that the sequence needs to end neatly for it to be counted as a proper sequence? Are you saying that you can't really extrapolate further?
So for the purposes of the first way, the sequence has to terminate in God, so it's got to terminate in the examples that intuitively, I'm happy to say, yeah, that's a real per se sequence, causal sequence, do all terminate uniquely. All the examples that I can think of, all the examples that I gave do terminate uniquely. Of course, we might be ignorant. There might be such series and we don't know where they terminate, right? I mean, this is a kind of silly example, but imagine that I'm sitting at the railway crossing watching the rolling stock going past and I give up and I turn around and I walk away. Then I never find out what kind of engine the train has, but I'm very confident I've got one. That would be a kind of example where, in a sort of epistemic sense, the termination's not neat. Let's pretend I love trains and I really care about what kind of engine it was. I didn't find out, right? And so it wasn't ultimately satisfying.
So with the example that you gave with the ball, the stick, and the hand, you said that it would terminate at the hand. But could you say?
No, it doesn't. It probably terminates with the person, right? I'm moving my arm, which is the stick, which is moving the ball. I abbreviated the example because.
Yeah, sure. Even with the person, would you not extend that to saying that the energy produced by your cells and then therefore the food that you ate and then regressing further and further?
No, I don't think so. I think that that particular sequence really does terminate with the person. And there are causal antecedents. Oh, sorry, what's the word? There are auxiliary causes or something like that. I don't know exactly how you want to describe what's going, the bearing of what's going on in the cells, right? It seems to me that if you ask what's moving me, right, in the relevant sense, the answer is there's not some other thing that's moving me, right? I'm moving my arm, which is moving the stick, which is moving the ball, but the moving of the arm just stops with me. That's what I'm thinking when I gave that example.
Well, thank you so much. That was all the questions I had for you.
Okay, cheers.
Returning.
Hello, Graham. I'm back. I've got another line of just another questioning. Say, I want to know your thoughts basically on the priority of space and time. So like I'll just kind of give away my own position. Like as somebody who's somewhat more read in the classical philosophical tradition in Aristotelianism, I know Aristotle will talk a lot about time being the measure for change, and also time being a kind of accident, meaning that substances are kind of more ontologically prior to time and to place. Now, I know that kind of following after some Newton, right? The conception has been that space and time are more absolute, although maybe that has been challenged. Maybe that intuition has been challenged by something like general relativity today. I guess I just want to ask, what's your like? Where do you place space and time as notions, and which are they more fundamental to, if you will?
Okay, so one of the questions in the kind of old terminology is whether space-time is a substance or not, right? Because if it's a substance, then it has a certain kind of fundamentality. Whereas if Leibniz is right, and you kind of give a relational account of space-time, so basically, space and time are just somehow or other the relations between substantial entities, then it turns out not to be fundamental in that sense. So that's one kind of question that you might be asking. And in the theory of general relativity, debate goes backwards and forwards about whether, according to general relativity, space is a substance or whether we can give a kind of relational analysis. There's a different question which I thought you might be going to ask, which is about the relative priority of causation and space-time. Can you have causes in the absence of time? Can you have causation in the absence of time? Hume thought not. He kind of built it into his definition of causation, that effects are temporally posterior to their causes. Whereas I'm not so sure that's right. I think that maybe you can have a kind of causal before and after without temporal cause before and after, even if you've got space, right? So, though the space will be rather different, maybe, from the way that we imagine it in general relativity. So that's a kind of different question.
Yeah, and actually that second line was kind of what was the intuition that I had was thinking about it, because my next point, which I guess you kind of already answered, was the relation between space and time and change, right? Because like if I'll go back to what Aristotle said, if time was the measure of change, it would seem to be that if you thought that if you had like an absolute notion of space and time, that it would be that not time that was the measure of change, but like change would be a measure of time, or like something that makes time kind of manifest as something before it. So I kind of already answered that. Fair enough.
Right. So it's worth saying that you can think that the difference between time and causation is that time has a metric, but causation doesn't. Right? There's no, you can't put a measure on how many causes happen between A and B. Right? Whereas you can measure the time interval. So if you imagine that the universe is kind of sparse enough early on, that like the causal universe is sparse enough early on, you'll just have the causal relations, but you won't have temporal relations because you won't get them. That's kind of the thought.
All right. Thank you again.
Paris, there's some more questions for you
again as well. I had a question about Christianity. So, like, there's some metaphysical claims against Christianity and the Trinity in particular that I often hear coming from people that follow Islam. I was wondering what your opinion on these as like a neutral atheist is. So one of them is that since God is qualitatively infinite, if Jesus is God, then it's a contradiction to enter into his creation, which is finite. And then the second claim is that another one asking about whether God the Son depends on God the Father for its existence, and just generally asking whether each member of the Trinity depends on each other, because it seems like the argument's going that, you know, if God can't depend, they're saying that God can't depend on anything, and if God is depending on some other thing for his existence, then it's not what we mean by God. And then the other option is that each of the members of the Trinity are independent, where then the claim is that if there's three independent existences, it seems to imply that there's like three gods or something like that. So what are your opinion on those claims?
Okay, so I'm hardly an expert on this, but when the doctrine of the Trinity was formulated, there were two things that were deemed to be heresies, right, that you could fall into. One of them was kind of modalism, thinking that the three things are just modes of a single God. That was deemed to be heretical. On the other side, there was the tritheism, that you ended up with three gods. And it's quite tricky to navigate between these two. And there's an enormous amount that's been written by people trying to navigate between those two things, the two heresies that you mustn't end up with. Now, some of the things that you suggested that some Muslims say about the doctrine of the Trinity is that it gets impaled on one or the other of the heresies, right? So it ends up saying that there are three gods, or it ends up saying that really there's just one God, but there's kind of maybe three different ways of thinking about that God, something like that. I don't think that the kind of sophisticated defenses of the Trinity end up being committed to either of those claims. But it's quite hard to be confident because it's quite hard to understand typical defenses of the Trinity, in my view. So if you think that somehow or other there are three relations, and somehow or other each of those relations is one of the members of the Trinity, then it makes it hard to, well, it's quite hard to understand how Jesus could be one of those relations of the Trinity, and how a relation could become incarnate. But that's not the only view. There are lots of views out there.
Yeah. Another question I had, there's also this claim I hear from theists that, like, if you're an atheist, you need to be committed to, like, that the idea that morality is subjective because it's only natural material stuff, and then if morality is subjective, then you can't make any claims about morality because it's all arbitrary. Like, personally, I think morality is subjective, but then I don't buy the second case. I don't think the sky's going to fall down. I wanted to hear your thoughts on how would you respond to that claim?
Right. So I don't think that you have to go with subjectivism or error theory or expressivism or some other sort of non-realist account of moral properties just because you're an atheist or a naturalist. Or that I kind of want to go with a kind of primitive necessity for moral claims. And so you end up with realism. There's no truth makers for the claims. I don't think that it's easy to decisively refute all of the range of positions that are open to naturalists. I think it's straightforward to defeat expressivism and error theory and subjectivism and so on.
Yeah. Okay. That was all the questions I had.
One last question, if you have the time for it.
Yeah.
It's from Ben.
Thank you so much.
Yep, I've got some questions. So Ayn Rand argued that the statement "God causes existence" is self-contradictory, as causation presupposes existence, and this rebuttal forms one of her arguments against the existence of God. What do you think about the quality of this argument?
Well, it's a shocker, isn't it?
I'm not an objectivist, by the way. But yeah, I was just wanted to.
So the idea that God causes existence would be, if you're going to think that it's true, it's going to be that God causes the existence of other things. right? It makes no sense according to me, though some theists disagree, to say that something causes itself. I mean, you just kind of try it out or that God explains God. I mean, just try it out with other things. If I ask you, what explains the blueness of the sky? And you say, the blueness of the sky explains the blueness of the sky. I just say, well, there's something wrong with you. You didn't understand what it is to give an explanation, right? A because A or A explains A is always wrong, right? So,
sorry,
go on.
No, I interrupted.
No, it's okay. Ask.
Oh, well, I don't know if I'm misunderstanding, but it sounds as though you are agreeing with Miss Rand.
No. So God exists. It can't be that God's existence is explained by God's existence. So when you say God causes existence, you must mean God causes the existence of other things. You can't possibly mean God causes God's existence, right? Because that's incoherent, right? But that was the first premise in the argument, right? That you were attributing to Ayn Rand.
Yeah. So, if we have time for another question.
Oh, was this your final question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, Bart Ehrman's atheism is largely driven by his belief that the resurrection of Christ never happened. Do you think that either lack of belief in the resurrection or positive belief in its falsity is sufficient to justify being an atheist?
No. So I think that there are probably plenty of theists who are Buddhists, atheists, who don't believe in the resurrection, right? So it can't be that just objecting to the resurrection is going to be a sufficient reason not to be a theist.
Yep. I think with that, I think we've gone through all the questions. Thank you very much for your time, Professor Oppy. If you did you have any more questions to go through? Or?
Yes. I did.
If you're happy for him to complete his final questions,
Yeah,
otherwise
sure.
I'll let you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about the following argument against fine-tuning? So it goes like this. So 1, only flawed beings have desires, wants, and plans because to strive for an end is to imply that you lack something. Number 2 is to assume God exists and is perfect. Number 3, perfect beings don't lack anything and thus don't have desires, wants, and plans. And number 4, the conclusion, therefore, even if God exists, it is unreasonable to say that he fine-tunes the universe, and that fine-tuning and by extension, the Abrahamic characterization of God is false. Do you think this argument against fine-tuning is better or worse than some of yours? And if so, why?
Okay, so interesting, right? So consider the claim that God wanted the fine-tuned constants to be as they are. You might think that one view that you can take is that that's not literally true. It's as Thomas might have said, analogically true. It's the best that we can say, even though literally God doesn't have desires. So that would be one view. Different view, if you go to the sort of Protestant traditions that suppose that God really is a person, really has desires and so on. God can have desires, but that doesn't imply any lack in God. Right? God wanted to make the world, but not because God was lonely or there was something missing in God's life or something like that. It's not because there was a lack. It was because, well, there are various accounts that you can give, but because God thought that it would be good for the creatures that God was going to make, that they exist, something like that. So it was more an expression of love than an expression of desire. That would be the kind of thing that you could say.
Right. Okay.
Totally good question.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to end by, I guess, pushing back a bit in that, like, in saying that he wanted to do it because he thought it would be good for, say, like the humans or the animals or something like that. To me, that begs the question of why he would care about that. That would also imply some sort of desire, and therefore the question for me still comes up again of, like, that seems to imply some sort of lacking.
Right. So, okay, you can say that, right? I've long puzzled about this, right? If God exists and God alone exists, then everything is perfect. If God creates a world like ours, it's no longer the case that everything is perfect. But how can it be that you get lack of perfection from perfection? Surely, if you've got perfection, it's not going to give rise to imperfection. Now, that's not exactly the argument that you're running, but it's a kind of cousin of it. I do think that it's puzzling. I don't think that it's unanswerable, but it's puzzling.
Yeah. Like, the implication of what I'm saying is, of course, that by saying that you want something, it does imply that affection is, like, implies limitation. So yeah, like, I understand. But yeah, that's all I wanted to really say. And I really thank you for your answers. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming to Socratic Society and joining us, answering many questions tonight. I know you probably want to have dinner or enjoy something else tonight. But so thank you very much for taking time out of your day for us. Thank you very much. If there's any other remarks or things you want to follow up with. Yeah. I was going to
I'll just say thanks very much for inviting me, and thanks very much for all of the questions.
All right, no problem. Thank you very much, Professor Oppy. We'll let you go now.
Thank you.
Cheers.